The promise and the silence. What you are watching unfold in Washington is not simply a foreign policy decision. It is a collision between a promise made and a promise broken, playing out in public in real time with the cameras rolling. The United States has launched full-scale airstrikes on Iran, not surgical, not symbolic, full-scale, and the story of how we got here does not begin with the first missile. It begins with a silence. Inside the White House, before the first strike was authorized, senior military leaders were raising documented concerns. According to CNN reporting, members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff briefed the president directly, warning that a major attack on Iran risked widening the conflict into a full regional war, that it could cost American lives, and critically, that it could further deplete an already strained weapons stockpile. That phrase deserves emphasis. Already depleted. The United States military was not entering this conflict from a position of surplus. It was entering from a position shaped by years of commitments in Ukraine, across the Pacific, and throughout the broader Middle East. General Dan Caney, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, reportedly communicated these concerns at the highest level. When a Washington Post report surfaced suggesting Caney had opposed the strikes, President Trump dismissed it as 100 incorrect. CNN then confirmed the concerns were real, raised formally in direct briefings with the president and his national security team. This is not a minor discrepancy. This is a commander-in-chief either unaware of what his own military leadership communicated to him or aware and choosing to deny it on national television. Either possibility represents a serious breakdown in the relationship between civilian leadership and military command. And that breakdown is the foundation on which everything that followed was built. The shifting justifications once the strikes began, a second problem emerged rapidly. The stated reasons for going to war kept changing. According to members of Congress who attended classified briefings and spoke publicly afterward, the stated goals for the operation shifted 4 or 5 times within days. Each new justification created new contradictions with the one before it. The first justification centered on Iran's missile program. The administration pointed to the threat posed by long-range Iranian missiles as the primary rationale. But this triggered an immediate problem. Officials had previously claimed that Iran's nuclear sites had already been, in the president's words, completely and totally obliterated. If the nuclear threat had already been neutralized, what was the nature of the new threat? Officials responded to this question by reasserting confidence rather than providing clarity, stating that they had a high degree of confidence about the obliteration of Iran's enriched uranium stockpiles. That confidence, it turned out, was not universally shared within the intelligence community. The justification then shifted to the protection of American allies, which opened an entirely different set of constitutional and legal questions. A Democratic congressman stated it plainly: there was no imminent threat to the United States from Iran. There was a threat to Israel. And if a threat to an ally is treated as legally equivalent to a threat to the United States itself, the administration was operating in unprecedented legal territory. A Pentagon briefing given to congressional staffers then offered yet another version. The concern was not that Iran would attack the United States directly, but that if Israel attacked Iran, Iran would retaliate against American assets. These versions are mutually exclusive. The administration presented both, and the press office pushed back on media outlets for accurately reporting the contradiction. The human and strategic cost beyond the political contradictions, the material cost of this conflict is becoming impossible to ignore. Among the most serious developments is a single strike that resulted in the deaths of approximately 150 people. Investigators, as of the time of this reporting, have concluded this strike was likely carried out by United States military forces. Among those killed, reporting indicates a school was struck. The administration's official response to this has been, in the president's own words, "We may have casualties. That often happens in war. Sadly, there will likely be more." No detailed accounting. No urgently announced investigation. No formal acknowledgement of the scale of what occurred. A former soldier watching these events described his reaction in terms that cut through every layer of political language. Watching people who know nothing of the horror that comes with this kind of violence celebrate this disgusts me, and then watching them tell us that these sacrifices are just what happens, that we need to be prepared for more casualties. It's not what happens to them, it's what happens to us. On the strategic side, the military advisors who warned against these strikes were concerned not only about lives but about long-term military capacity. Weapon stockpiles that have been drawn down through years of commitments in Ukraine and the Pacific are not replenished quickly. The fracture inside the coalition, perhaps the most historically significant dimension of this story, is the one receiving the least coherent coverage. The fracture inside the MAGA political coalition. This fracture is not peripheral. It goes to the center of what that coalition was built on. For years, one of the foundational promises of the America First movement was explicit. Opposition to foreign wars, to Middle Eastern entanglements, to the kind of regime change operations that neoconservative hawks had championed for decades. Donald Trump himself, at rallies and in speeches, told his supporters, "I will not send American kids to fight and die in the Middle East." That promise is now broken, and the loudest voices saying so are not Democrats. They are people from inside the tent, prominent conservative commentators and influencers who helped build the political energy that brought this administration to power are publicly asking where figures like G.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard have gone. One such voice stated, "I'm on video on campaign stages and at Trump rallies saying the exact same thing. No more foreign wars, no more regime change, but where are they now?" And then something even more significant was said openly. "My own feeling is that no one should have to die for a foreign country. I don't think those for service members died for the United States. I think they died for Iran or for Israel. This is not a foreign policy disagreement. This is a rupture in the political compact that held this coalition together. When the people who built the movement publicly declare that American soldiers died for another country's interests, the coalition has not just cracked, it has begun a process that political realignments are made of. The economic architecture of the conflict, the financial dimension of this conflict, has not received the serious analytical treatment it deserves. Multiple reporting outlets have placed the operational cost of the ongoing strikes at approximately $1 billion per day. If active operations continue through September, as has been indicated, the direct operational cost approaches $150 billion, and that figure does not include the strategic costs of weapons stockpile depletion, which takes years and significant industrial investment to reverse. The geographic stakes compound this. The Persian Gulf handles roughly 20% of the world's daily oil transit every day. Tankers carrying millions of barrels of crude pass through the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that Iran has explicitly threatened to close in the event of military escalation. A closure, even temporary, even partial, would send an energy price shock through every major economy simultaneously. Europe, which has spent years reconfiguring its energy supply chains, would feel it immediately. Asia, which depends on Gulf oil at a scale that dwarfs Western consumption, would feel it at the industrial level. American consumers would see the effects at the pump within days. Financial markets have already begun pricing in the elevated risk defense sector equities. Moved upward. Airline and shipping stocks moved in the opposite direction. The so-called war premium embedded in energy futures shifted noticeably in the hours following confirmation of the strikes. Major institutional investors issued guidance on repositioning and exposure management. This is not speculation. This is capital moving in response to real risk calculations made by professionals whose job is to be accurate. The secondary effects, the ones not yet priced in, are the ones that matter most for a sustained conflict. Insurance market adjustments, sovereign wealth fund repositioning, and the quiet recalculation that regional governments are already performing about the long-term reliability of American partnerships. The two paths forward. Looking at the structure of this situation clearly, two distinct paths present themselves. There is no stable middle ground between them. The first path is a negotiated off-ramp. Iranian leadership, having absorbed significant military damage, signals through established back-channel intermediaries, likely Oman or Qatar, a willingness to enter negotiations. The administration frames whatever emerges from those discussions as a decisive victory. The strikes created the leverage produced the diplomacy, and the diplomacy delivered results. The political coalition, strained but not broken, rallies around the narrative of success. The internal fractures get papered over, at least temporarily. The conditions for this path are specific. Someone on the Iranian side must conclude that the cost of continued confrontation outweighs whatever strategic value the conflict has produced. Someone on the American side must be willing to define a winning outcome in terms that actually allow for an exit. Neither condition is guaranteed, but neither is impossible. The second path is escalation. An Iranian proxy group or Iran itself carries out a retaliatory strike against American personnel or assets in the region. The administration cannot absorb such a strike quietly without paying an enormous political price. A response triggers further retaliation. The conflict becomes explicitly regional. Other actors make calculations based on the new reality. The diplomatic architecture that has imperfectly but functionally contained the Middle East begins to fracture under the pressure of events moving faster than anyone anticipated. At that point, the billion-dollar per day estimate becomes optimistic. The political fracture inside the coalition goes from damaging to potentially decisive, and the gap between what was promised and what was delivered becomes a permanent feature of the political landscape, not a temporary vulnerability to be managed. A congressman on the House floor summarized the pattern with precision. Republicans went from imminent threat to regime change to nukes back to imminent threat in the last 24 hours. That is the architecture of this story. Not one decision, but a series of shifting justifications that together reveal an administration that acted first and searched for reasons afterward. The reckoning here is the factual summary of what the United States has done. It has entered a military conflict with a significant regional power. It did so without a coherent or consistent stated objective. It did so over the documented concerns of senior military leadership. It did so with a political coalition at home that is visibly fracturing along lines that predate this specific conflict. It is doing so at an estimated cost of $1 billion per day. And in the course of that conflict, approximately 150 people were killed in a single strike that investigators believe was carried out by American forces. A CNN poll conducted in the days following the strikes found that nearly 6 in 10 Americans disapprove of the strikes on Iran. 59% say they do not trust President Trump to make the right decisions on the use of force. 60% do not believe the administration has a clear plan for how to handle the situation. When 6 in 10 Americans express distrust of the commander-in-chief's judgment during an active military operation, that is not an approval rating problem, that is a crisis of political legitimacy. The people most likely to bear the human cost of this conflict are the same working-class Americans who were promised no more foreign wars, the communities that send their children into military service because it offers a path to education and economic stability are among the core constituents of the coalition that was built, in significant part, on anti-interventionist rhetoric that is not just a political observation. It is a moral accountability that does not dissolve when the news cycle moves on. The question that remains, the one that will define the retrospective judgment of this moment, is simple. When the political price of this conflict becomes impossible to sustain, what does the exit look like, and who is left paying for it? Because in these situations, someone always pays, the accounting always comes due, the only variable is who is holding the bill when it does.